Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis Project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. My name is Eliane Schmid, and I will be hosting today's conversation centering on the ancient philosophy of skepticism. To discuss what skepticism means in philosophical terms, I am joined by Katja Vogt, professor of philosophy at Columbia University in New York. Katja Vogt explores fundamental questions surrounding values, knowledge, and truth, while offering unique insights into epistemic norms in ethics. Currently, Katja is pondering and doing research on the role of truth in decision-making, disagreement, and skepticism, and is also working on a book entitled The Original Stoics. Katja Vogt, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, reading newspapers and studying media discourses, eyeing political debates, I cannot help but think that we certainly do not live in a world where skepticism is widespread or has many adherents. Because, if I understand correctly, skeptics are very cautious when expressing opinions, if they do so at all. Public debates are teeming with dogmatic assertions, and when doubts are addressed, then always in connection to doubting others, not oneself. Katja, would you agree that a little more skepticism would do us good in our maybe discursive interaction with one another?
That sounds great to me. Yes, I would certainly agree that a bit more skepticism would do us good. I find it important to mention that the ancient word skepsis means inquiry. So it doesn't mean doubt. And that's an important thing to notice. Modern skepticism, starting with Cartesian skepticism, Descartes' skepticism that he envisages, is about a skeptic who doubts things. And doubt can seem to be an unpleasant state, something that one wants to get rid of. But if you think of the skeptic as someone who engages in inquiry, in investigation, then all of a sudden it doesn't seem like that is such an unpleasant thing to do. Maybe that is a great way to live, to be an inquirer. So that, I think, already changes the picture a little bit. And I would certainly defend the view that for us, that is an excellent way to live. All the big questions, whether they are in science or questions about how we should live, what is right, what is wrong, blah, 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 all of that deserves further inquiry. I think very few people would claim to have complete answers if they reflect upon it. And if not, then the attitudes of the skeptic, which are geared toward ongoing inquiry, in fact, seem appropriate. And now here's another kind of way you can look at this. On the one hand, yes, you're right. It seems as if people nowadays, and probably also in antiquity, assert beliefs, assert in a kind of 100% credence way, this is how it is. And that is often how everyday discourse, also political discourse, can seem to be. I'm not so sure myself that that is a correct description. I think that a lot of the kind of reservations that we have regarding our own views are conveyed implicitly. Philosophers use a technical term here, the term hedges. A hedge is when you say, for example, to the best of my knowledge, such and such, or, I believe such and such. And we don't always do that explicitly. We also just, hesitate a little bit before we answer a question, or we shrug our shoulders, or we, some other gesture or whatever that implicitly conveys that what I'm going to say now is what seems to me, but I'm not telling you that this is necessarily how the world really is. And these kinds of hedges, I think, are actually fairly frequent. And if we pay attention to them, then we might think that we are in some sense more skeptical than it can appear, because that is somewhat similar to how skeptics talk. Skeptics say what appears to them to be the case in ways that invite further investigation.
So would you say that in that case, there is more skepticism to be found nowadays than I initially thought? And maybe could you also say what a conversation would look like between two or more skeptics in that case? How would they converse with one another?
That's a great question. I don't want to make empirical claims about how many utterances by people are this way or that way. But I think that at least upon reflection, many people would qualify their own utterances, the things they say, as, yeah, sure, I'm not saying that this is how it really is. I'm saying what looks to me to be the case. And I'm only using kind of plainer language because that's more convenient, or that is kind of how linguistic conventions work. But really what I try to say is, this is how it looks to me. An example that is sometimes used nowadays in related discussions that are a little bit different but still related, is that someone asks you, is the bank open on Saturday? And then, let's say you think that your friend who asks this question needs to do something important at the bank, which is really which impacts their life. Now, you might say, I think the opening hours are 9 to 12. But, by saying it in this kind of way with a little bit of hesitation, really what you're saying is maybe check again, rather than rely on what I was saying. So I think that is kind of how often we, in fact, talk to each other. And that is somewhat similar to how the skeptics would talk.
So it's very much about linguistics, it seems, and the way that we phrase our sentences to soften them.
Yeah, I think it is. So the earliest kind of skepticism, uses a lot of so-called, in Greek, phonai. Those are expressions that are somewhat terminological, or that are somewhat, used in a technical way, which aim to flag that really everything we say has these kinds of slightly hypothetical hedges, or kind of minimal proviso that, well, this is how it looks to me. But, we can think about it further. We can check, we can inquire further. Further evidence may come along. And the ancient skeptics compare themselves as inquirers with what they call dogmatists. And so what is a dogmatist? What is dogmatism? The term today has a quite negative tone to it. Today we think a dogmatist is someone who is kind of somehow stubbornly wedded to their views. The skeptics use dogmatism simply for any kind of view that is uttered or expressed or held without that kind of proviso that this is how it seems to me, as opposed to this is how it is. So any philosopher who says this is how the world is will count as a dogmatist. But then you can ask yourself, is that actually what philosophers do? That is not so clear. If you, for example, if you go to a journal in philosophy nowadays and you look at the structure of arguments, people will often say, I'm going to work with such and such a model. And if such and such a premise holds, then such and such is not compelling. And that is ultimately, that is not dogmatism, because that is a conditional or hypothetical way of putting forward a view where you flag that, well, I'm only saying this kind of with the proviso that there's further work to be done on whether this model is compelling, or whether this premise that I simply presuppose really holds, and so on and so forth. So back to your question, how much is this about the language? It is both about the language and about mental states. And there is an assumption that how you talk is as it were a correlate of your mental states. And of course, you can talk in ways that do not convey your mental states. People can lie and they can deceive each other and all of that. But the skeptics assume that, at least for the most part, when someone says something, that is as it were a kind of linguistic correlate of their mental state, of the views they hold, or how things look to them, the beliefs they hold, and so on. So when someone makes an assertion, where assertion is the technical term for a what grammatically you would call a declarative sentence, such and such is so and so. When someone makes an assertion, the skeptics would assume that that is the linguistic correlate of a belief, in Greek, a doxa.
Now, you mentioned the ancient skeptics quite a few times now. Maybe we should go back to the origins of skepticism, namely to Pyrrho of Elis himself. What kind of person was Pyrrho to have come up with this idea that maybe, also, like you now said, to link what is said with a mental state, but then also, as maybe conventionally one thinks of skeptics being people that refrain from giving personal opinions. Maybe could you put that in context a bit?
Yeah. So Pyrrho is really kind of odd figure. He's not necessarily a sympathetic figure. The stories about him, the anecdotes about him make him look quite difficult to deal with. He has long been considered the founder or ancestor of Pyrrhonian skepticism, and that, and of course the name suggests this. So later thinkers who are in one way or another in the Pyrrhonian tradition, they presumably invoke Pyrrho. However, that has come under scrutiny in the past 10 or 20 years. The assumption that Pyrrho is a skeptic has been rejected at this point by almost all philosophers who work on this. And why is that? Because Pyrrho holds metaphysical views about the nature of things, how things are. So he is, by the lights of later Pyrrhonian skeptics, a dogmatist.
This is an interesting turn of what I also read previously. So I'm curious to know more about that and what then defines the Pyrrhonian skeptics.
Right. So Pyrrho did come up with what you initially in your question flagged, namely this connection or link between mental states and how, if you shouldn't think in such and such a way, then you also shouldn't talk in such and such a way. So he thought, or he argued, presumably we don't have too much evidence, but he argued that we should not hold any opinions, and that the linguistic correlate of that would be to not make assertions, not utter declarative sentences. Instead, we should say of everything that it is no more this than that. And no more this than that is one of these expressions that I mentioned before, a kind of formulaic, technical, skeptical phrase, where, for example, you look at the ocean and you say, this is no more blue than not blue. And by that, you aim to capture that, well, you look at the ocean and you could say, well, it has many shades. It looks green, it looks blue, it looks gray. But really the kind of correct thing to say about it, according to Pyrrho, is it is no more blue than not blue. It is no more gray than not gray, and so on and so forth. So you're supposed to, by using that type of formulation, avoid that you ascribe a property to things. And he holds the metaphysical claim that things are indeed indeterminate. So that is a quite complicated idea. The idea is that it is genuinely not the case that the ocean is such and such a color. So it's not that it has such and such a color and you and I just fail to detect that. Rather, it just doesn't have a determinate color, which is quite similar to, let's say, if you think about Heraclitean flux or theories like that, where the thought is that the world is in change, is constantly in change, such that the things in the world simply do not have enough stability to have fixed properties.
So I'm curious now that you mentioned how Pyrrho actually said that you can never really, in that case, describe anything if you cannot say that you perceive the ocean as blue. How do you converse with one another if you can never make any statements to move from? I mean, I agree that it's a nice idea that you shouldn't go and tell people the ocean is blue and that's the only way to see it. But you need to have a starting point to start a conversation.
Correct. So this is kind of an almost impossible position. And these expressions that are being used, these formulaic expressions like no more this than that, the ocean is no more blue than not blue, no more gray than not gray, and so on, are intended as mere approximations. And really, the world is indeterminate in such a way that we cannot talk about it. So you're right, this is a radical position. It's a quite extreme position, highly revisionist position. And in that sense, similar to some of the most extreme kinds of early Greek metaphysics, Protagorean relativism, as it is described in Plato's Theaetetus, involves Heraclitean flux, which is the idea that everything is in motion in every respect. And if that is the case, you don't have stable objects, you don't have stable properties, and you and I cannot refer to the same thing. You and I will, if you say this is green and I say this is blue, then the this in our utterances is not going to pick out the same thing because there are no stable things. So Pyrrho's position is similar to that. It is a truly revisionist view, and it is a metaphysical view about how the world is. And in that sense, it is genuinely quite deeply different from later skepticism, where skepticism, as I mentioned initially, skepsis means inquiry, investigation. The skeptics do not make claims about how the world is. And that is the deep difference. That is, why Pyrrho isn't really a skeptic, because he does make claims about how the world is. And then the later Pyrrhonian skeptics, they don't. They think of themselves as investigators, as inquirers, as, being engaged in an ongoing inquiry. And that permits a kind of slightly more ordinary ways of talking, because then you can say, the sea looks blue to me, and someone else can say it looks green to me. And even though you're not making assertions, you can still have a conversation. So that is, in that sense, much less radical.
So it's a more useful twist to the beginnings that Pyrrho said in that sense. So more applicable, and it has become more applicable after him.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know about applicability. I think I can see what you're saying. Yes, kind of later Pyrrhonian skepticism is more livable. What Pyrrho proposes seems utterly extreme, and it's difficult to imagine how anyone would actually talk that way, live that way. But I would argue that the deep difference really resides in whether you hold a revisionist metaphysical view or not. Because once you think that the world is genuinely in motion in every respect all the time and so on and so forth, I mean, that is Heraclitean flux, but that's a kind of intuitive way of getting some of the intuitions that I think inform Pyrrho's position. If indeed you think that the world is indeterminate, then you have to try and do justice to that. And that, of course, is really difficult, but that's what you're going to try to do. And whereas then the later skeptics, they suspend judgment on how the world is.
No, you said that the perception was that the world is constantly in flux, and that's also why you cannot make firm assessments because it's always changing. Now, as I learned, the Pyrrhonian skeptics actually were trying to refrain from giving opinions just because they thought it was also better for your inner peace of mind, and so that you would become calmer if you don't have opinions on everything. But I do wonder if you're of the opinion that everything is constantly changing, how can you be calm?
That's a great question. So again, keep apart Pyrrho on the one hand, and then Pyrrhonian skeptics on the other hand. So, and as I said, this idea that everything is in flux is Heraclitean metaphysics. It's not what Pyrrho directly says. But there's a kind of family of views, relativism, Heraclitean flux, and to some extent atomism, and Pyrrho, who engage with this intuition that the world is sort of full of conflicting appearances. It looks one way to you, another way to me, another way to the dog, another way to the elephant, and so on and so forth. And how are we going to do justice to that? So that is the shared starting point between Pyrrho and Heraclitean metaphysics and relativism and so on. So if you think the world is full of conflicting appearances, how must the world be for that to be the case? That is the question. And Pyrrho's answer is the world must be indeterminate. Now, again, that is a metaphysical stance. And you could say, well, how is that going to give me tranquility? Because that seems actually pretty radical and maybe disquieting. And you would be right. But the intuition is that, and that is in fact an intuition that is shared with many Greek philosophers, that as radical as it might be, but the most important thing is to do justice to how things really are. So we are not looking for a kind of fake tranquility. Ideally, we are tranquil or have peace of mind because we actually do justice to how things are. And, then how does that work for later skeptics who are not holding any views about how the world is? They would say, and that is a kind of really Socratic idea, that the only rational way to live is to see how big the questions are that we deal with, that we do not have the answers. So the only rational response to that is that we continue to investigate. And that is, as it were, a commitment to rationality. That is doing justice to how hard these questions are, how important they are, and so on and so forth. So that is kind of, throughout all of these different traditions, tranquility is not pursued as something that is, could as well be fake. It is hard earned. You need to somehow do justice to rational commitments to figuring out how things are.
Now, using the tranquility idea again to go back a bit, so Diogenes reports actually on all kinds of anecdotes concerning Pyrrho. And Pyrrho, for example, he says, was on the ship voyage and a storm occurred. So that's one of the anecdotes. And apparently all passengers panicked, but he himself remained calm, referring to a feeding piglet and saying that a wise man must preserve such ataraxia. Could you explain more about this strong sense of tranquility, again, to being connected to a wise person? So how can we read this concrete passage?
Right. I mean, so those anecdotes about Pyrrho encountering something and being entirely tranquil while everyone else is freaking out are part of this kind of tradition of describing him as a wise person. And in this anecdote and in many other anecdotes, it's important to understand that these anecdotes are often quite unrealistic. So, I'm not an expert on pigs, but, think of a storm, think of all the commotion. How likely is it that the little piglet would not be very nervous? So, it is not, the way to read this is not to assume that this in fact happened. The way to read it is to ask, why would Pyrrho think that it is somehow a good thing to be compared to an animal? And how is that part of his philosophical outlook? So Pyrrho is, part of this approach of not holding opinions, not saying things about how the world is, and so on and so forth, or, in how the world is in some determinate way, is to invoke ideas that he thinks go back even to Homer, according to which human beings overestimate themselves greatly by thinking that they are reasoners who can, who see how things are and can perceive the world as it is, and who perform actions that are based on rational deliberation and so on. And Pyrrho instead quotes Homer with, ideas like human lives are like leaves on trees, for example, or we are like wasps and flies and birds. And what does that mean? It means that human beings we are just yet another bit of nature. Don't think that you are so different from these other bits of nature, these other kinds of living beings. Don't overestimate your own rational access to the world. So for him, it would not have been a negative comparison to say that he acts like a piglet. On the contrary, it would have been, yeah, sure, like this is in fact how human beings, we are much more like piglets than we think we are. And if I am able to respond to a situation accordingly, then that is a good thing. Now, is it therefore realistic that there was this commotion on the ship and that the pig was calm and so on? No, but there is a kind of philosophical upshot to this. And the tranquility idea is, if you do not hold opinions, the thought is, then you are not pulled towards the idea, well, this is how it is. And then you're also not disturbed by the next contrary appearance. That is the idea. So as soon as you are in the business of forming opinions, the thought is you are going to be in some kind of inner turmoil because the world is such that it is full of these conflicting appearances. So the moment you would think, well, this is how it is. No, it is different. There's, now it looks different. And so the claim that we should not hold opinions is connected to the claim that we should also not waver. And waver here means that we should not feel torn between, is it this way, is it that way? And as soon as you think, well, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to hold an opinion, you then think, well, now I think it's this way. But then there's a conflicting appearance and you think, oh no, it's this other way. So forming opinions is, according to that kind of picture that Pyrrhon presents, a kind of tumultuous and disturbing thing. Whereas if you just don't do that because you accept what he says, namely that the world is indeterminate, then you're not going to be in that kind of turmoil.
This seems to me also to be almost a bit of a resignated stance, and also to shield yourself a bit from maybe being hurt, because if you have particular opinions about people and then it turns out that they are not the way you thought they were, then you might possibly be hurt, right? So is this a form of shielding yourself from negative things?
That's an interesting question. I think, yes, it could have that implication. I don't think that is what motivates it. I think it is motivated sort of from that metaphysical perspective and from sort of genuinely taking seriously that the world is full of conflicting appearances. What are we going to make of this? And so Pyrrhon would, if you were to talk to Pyrrhon about this, if you were to ask him that question, I suspect he would say, is it really the case that your friend seems loyal to you, or doesn't your friend seem loyal and illoyal to you? Even now, where you love them. And so the thought would be that is just it's as if an existential perception of how it is to be a human being, that it just isn't the case that things seem to us to be just one way. And then, of course, you're right that if we don't hold views like she is trustworthy, we're not going to be disappointed by her not being trustworthy the next day. So yes, that's right. The motivation for it, I think, is really how do we adequately form mental states and utter, linguistic items such as to do justice to the fact that even now the friend doesn't just appear loyal to you. The friend appears loyal and illoyal and whatever.
Now, maybe also to continue this thought, there are also other anecdotes that actually show that Pyrrhon himself was not immune to falling for these conceptions still, nonetheless. So there's the anecdote that he was apparently being attacked by a dog, again, another animal, and he did not remain calm at all. How did he react in this situation when people then said, well, you weren't calm this time, and you told us before that we should always be calm?
Right. So apparently he was shocked and terrified by the dog, as pretty much anyone would be if they are attacked by a dog. And then, as as justification, he said, well, it is hard to shed one's humanity entirely. And scholars don't really know what that means. But I think the most plausible way to read it is to say, well, that is a kind of deep-seated human response. As a theorizer, Pyrrho thinks that is not an adequate response. But it is hard to entirely get rid of typical human responses, and in particular in a kind of emergency situation like being attacked, it might be difficult to live in a way that is entirely in line with one's theoretical convictions.
And maybe now to move away from Pyrrho a bit, there's also Sextus Empiricus. Can you explain to us why he is relevant in all this?
Yeah. So Sextus Empiricus, the history of Pyrrhonian skepticism spans a long time, roughly 5.5 centuries. And that is fairly unusual for a philosophical movement. Typically, say you have a school and you have clusters of people who are at least roughly contemporaries. But in this case, with Pyrrhonian philosophy, you have Pyrrho and his student Timon early on, roughly contemporaries of Epicurus. And then a long time later, you have Sextus Empiricus, who is the philosopher whose written work informs our views on Pyrrhonian skepticism, more than anyone else's works. He wrote extensive treatises, and they have survived. So we can read this, we can study this, whereas the two important figures in between, Agrippa and Aeneasidemus, we have very little evidence, and most of the evidence that we have is actually contained within Sextus Empiricus. So Sextus Empiricus is the go-to person if you want to learn about ancient skepticism or Pyrrhonian skepticism. That is what you're going to read. And Sextus wrote 2 sets of treatises, which in fact show slightly divergent perspectives. The set of treatises that is, in my view and in the view of some other scholars, the one that he wrote first, is slightly more dogmatic, where that means that some of his conclusions are, hence, there is no such and such. There is no movement, there is no time, there is no causation, or whatever it might be. Whereas the treatises that scholars typically think, and I think, are his mature work. And, the edition of that is called Outlines of Pyrrhonism, and it's 3 books contained in that. They always end with, like, every bit of inquiry ends with, hence, the skeptic suspends judgment on time, on causation, on whatever it might be. So that is what scholars typically think, this is really what Pyrrhonian skepticism is. That is the definitive treatment, in a way, of, with a lot of simplification, but that is, as it were, the most sophisticated, most extensive, most detailed, nuanced treatment that we have of a position that aims to make sense of ongoing inquiry, suspending judgment on all of those questions, and coming up with a language, how the skeptic would speak in order to capture this, and answering all sorts of challenges, how can the skeptic live? How can they be active? And so on and so forth. So, Pyrrho, who we talked about so far, we know, in fact, very little. We have these anecdotes and we have a few fragments of testimony. But things really are quite different with Sextus Empiricus. We can read a lot and we can access a highly sophisticated position.
This is interesting to me, though, that you said that at least one of his treatises is rather dogmatic, which is exactly the opposite of what skepticism should be, right?
Well, it's dogmatic in the sense that it does not fully avoid coming to conclusions. And it kind of aims to do that, but it's really hard. I mean, if you were to try to write extensive treatises and never have a sentence anywhere which says, and hence such and such is not the case. That's, you need a lot of, as it were, skeptical discipline in order to never make that kind of inference. And these treatises that scholars, including myself, think are the earlier ones, the ones where his position is as of yet less refined, they kind of fall victim to this kind of quote unquote mistake once in a while. But possibly that is even a kind of failure by his own lights. So the attempt is to come up with this philosophy of suspension of judgment, just sort of once in a while, we kind of still say such and such is not the case, or such and such doesn't hold. And then, of course, you can sort of try to save him. You can try to say, well, he's not really saying that. Rather, he says the arguments for such and such that the other philosophers put forward are not compelling. And so that is a kind of reading that is sometimes described as dialectical, because it is sort of, you imagine that he always has an interlocutor. You imagine that he always has an interlocutor who is, for example, a Stoic philosopher or an Epicurean philosopher. And then when he says, hence such and such, we need to do away with causation, or, such, he had formulations like that, which sound dogmatic, that this isn't really what he says, maybe, but instead he says, so far, no one has given us a compelling theory of causation, and hence, so far, there's nothing out there that we can accept. And that would be skeptical. There are disputes about how best to read this, but the kind of distinction that I introduced by distinguishing between his two sets of treatises is that he is, as it were, better in the second set of treatises at avoiding moments where it can seem that he is dogmatic.
It just seems like a really difficult thing to write about what being devoid of judgment means without giving some judgment to explain this. So it seems like an almost impossible task.
No, that's right. I mean, if I may, like, one way Sextus reflects on this quite extensively in this, in my view, more sophisticated set of treatises called Outlines of Pyrrhonism. In the first book of that, so that consists of 3 treatises, or 3 books, which make up this one treatise. And the first of these books is a kind of report, and it's explicitly flagged as this is a report of how the skeptics do it. And this word report is used in a kind of technical way where you say, I am reporting or laying open my mental states. I'm not saying that this is what you should do. I'm not saying that this is the right thing to do or anything like this. I'm just telling you this is how it is for us. We, the skeptics, we encounter these conflicting appearances. Initially, that was a tumultuous experience for us. Then we discovered tranquility by suspension of judgment, which we kind of discovered in some coincidental way. And now this is how we live. Now we engage in these ongoing inquiries, and we kind of hit upon suspension of judgment combined with tranquility again and again. And that is how we live. And this is how we talk in order to convey our mental states. But it's all kind of phrased in this, let me tell you what's going on in my mind kind of way, rather than this is how you should live or anything like this.
I am very fascinated by this very careful wording, and I'm curious to read some original texts. But now I would also like to ask, because you mentioned the Stoics and the Epicureans before, how did they react to conversing with someone like Sextus, who wouldn't maybe jump into concrete arguments with them?
That's a great question. So the traditional view is that Stoicism and skepticism kind of develop alongside each other in conversation by challenging each other. That is a simplification, and I'm not entirely convinced by that. I'll say more about this in a moment, but it is nevertheless a kind of useful stepping stone for trying to make sense of what's going on. Importantly, it is not the case that the Stoics simply lay out a view and say this is how it is. On the contrary, the Stoics say that knowledge of the world is in principle attainable, but they do not know anyone who has it. Hence, they find themselves currently in the same situation in which the skeptics are. So this is a conversation among fellow inquirers. This is a conversation among people who agree much more than this is often recognized today. And Michael Friede has written about this that in a paper that has been hugely influential and that really kickstarted decades of research, where he argues that it is a mistake to think that the Stoics are these kind of stern dogmatists, and on the other hand, you have these skeptics. Rather, these are people who almost find themselves in the same situation. They agree that there are all these big questions which require that we take them seriously and that we become investigators. They do not take themselves to have knowledge in response to these questions. And then what is the difference? The difference is that the Stoics argue that knowledge is in principle available, whereas the skeptics, as it were, suspend judgment on this. We are still trying, is as it were the answer. But in that conversation then, with many shared premises, the Stoics lay out there a kind of basic picture of how the human mind works. And that has become hugely influential later on in philosophy, but also for the skeptics, namely to assume that, well, there are really three things going on in the human mind. One is impressions, in Greek phantasiae, or today we might say mental representations. Something looks to you a certain way. You look at the cup of tea that is in front of you and you have this representation, here's a cup of tea. Then there is the second type of thing in the human mind is whether you accept this, assent to this impression, or reject it, or suspend judgment on it. And in that context, the Stoics coined this notion of suspension of judgment, which is not a notion in Pyrrho, but which emerges in the Stoic skeptic conversation. And then the third thing that goes on in the human mind is if you assent to an impression about what to do, then you have an impulse for action. So that is a kind of basic philosophy of mind that the skeptics seem to dialectically work with. So when the skeptics explain their philosophy, when they report how they investigate and so on, they do it in some sense in Stoic terms. They say things seem to us a certain way. We don't assent to that. We don't accept these impressions. Rather, we suspend judgment on them. And that is a deep connection, a deep conceptual connection between the Stoics and the skeptics, that in some sense their discussion proceeds in Stoic terms. Now, the Epicureans also in some sense share a version of that picture of the human mind. You have impressions, which is different from actually forming a belief, assenting to them or not, so that they don't use the notion of assent, but they use kind of similar notions. And it has become clear in recent years that even though the conceptual connection between skeptics and Stoics is so deep, there are also quite deep connections between skeptics and Epicureans, in other respects.
But now I'm wondering, since there are deep connections between each other, how come, and I don't know if this is a question that is even answerable, but somehow in the English-speaking world, the Stoics seem quite popular again. And there's a lot of contemporary books being produced now also for a broad mass. But the skeptics, not so much. Is it because maybe Stoicism is still a bit more graspable? Or do you have any idea why that is?
That's a great question. One thing that is distinctive about the, if you like, revival of Stoic philosophy is that we have texts from people like Seneca or Marcus Aurelius that are pretty accessible in the sense that they have actually survived not just in fragments, but as complete texts. There are translations out there which are pretty good translations, which are not expensive. Like you can just go and purchase a book and read it. That is not really the case with any of the Greek material. So the Greek Stoics, who are interlocutors of the skeptics, we have their texts only in fragments. So the kinds of Stoics that I've been talking about so far here, the Stoics who are interlocutors of the skeptics, they also do not attract a wide readership, because that is pretty much impossible. You have to work your way through fragments, and those are collected in editions that are very scholarly and so on. So I would say that, yes, accessibility is a big issue here. On the other hand, I would say that it's not clear to me that skepticism does not somehow also see a revival. There is a lot of work in contemporary epistemology about, for example, what I earlier called hedges. How do we qualify our utterances such that they do not express 100% credence, as it were? There's also a lot of work about so-called epistemic norms. How do we form beliefs such that our beliefs are sensitive to evidence? There is discussion of the so-called dogmatism puzzle, which goes back to Kripke. And because that was not initially published or not widely known, and is all of a sudden now has now been published in a more accessible way, people discuss it quite a bit. There, the puzzle is, if you know something, that's great. Knowledge isn't that the best epistemic state? Sure. But that makes it look as if you no longer need to attend to evidence. Now, that's not a good thing, not attending to evidence. So the puzzle is, knowledge is a great thing and presumably the best epistemic state, but somehow we still want people to continue to attend to evidence, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if you already have knowledge. And then you can ask, why is it that we still want people to attend to evidence if they already have knowledge? There's a lot to say about this. But the reason I bring it up is that I think a lot of discussions in epistemology today actually quite, resonate with ideas in ancient skepticism. Selections from Sextus Empiricus are studied in standard intro to epistemology classes because there is this kind of resonance. So yes, you're right about accessibility and about a sort of wider audience. In other ways, I think that ancient skepticism offers arguments that speak to a lot of people, and that if we had even better editions than we have, it is only in the recent decades, or even with respect to some treatises, recent years, that there are paperback editions that someone could just purchase. And it always takes a little bit of time for that then to really shape the kind of wider perception of a philosophy.
Yeah, because if I think about what you said in the very beginning about skepticism being very much about inquiry, then this would be a fun thing to use nowadays also, because we are curious, I think, or I hope at least, that in all these changes that are happening at very fast pace with the technological developments, so then skepticism would fit in well here, and it would be good if we knew more about skepticism in that sense, if it could be comparable with just sparking a certain curiosity and openness towards new topics.
No, I agree. And I think that there's always a question of, what do you think is sort of your model for the philosophical approach that you find compelling? And skepticism is very much modeled after scientific inquiry. So the types of questions that Sextus Empiricus, for example, discusses by way of example in his treatises are questions that today we might describe as questions in physics. And also questions in ethics, but sort of big picture questions, what is the good, and stuff like this. I would suspect that most of us today think that those questions are not answered, and that by contrast, it is in fact quite plausible to assume that physics and natural science is going to be an ongoing project, that, as much as we already know, there's always going to be the next question, and there's always more work that we can do, and that is an exciting thing and an interesting thing and so on. It is not a disappointing thing.
Yeah, more than ever, it seems the natural sciences are very much looked at for a sense of security, I think, in society, that you but now also a combination with that, as you said, we want to know what is good, how do we lead a good life, and so forth on maybe a personal level. But then to find security in, for example, we had the pandemic, then suddenly people want to know more how all that works. So it seems that maybe skepticism can help us navigate through these different kinds of sciences.
I think that is a great example with the pandemic. One challenge that is always brought up against skepticism is if you say that you do not have knowledge, that you cannot assert that things are such and such, then you cannot live an ordinary life. Then you cannot perform actions because you need to think that something is one way or the other in order to orient your actions. And the skeptics say, no, that is by no means the case. We can be oriented by what seems to us to be the case. And I think that that is an extremely important insight. So, for example, in contexts like the pandemic, but also other contexts like climate change and so on, big societal challenges that have a major scientific side to them. It is a mistake, I think, to say that, because there are still some open questions, hence we have nothing to guide our actions. We have a lot to guide our actions, and it is rational to go by the best evidence we currently have. So those are questions that have become quite widely debated in recent years because there is a kind of political dispute about, how can we deal with science if sometimes the next study already says something different? And that is sometimes the case. Sometimes it is the case that a couple months later, we have more evidence in some significant way. And then it can sort of seem that, oh, well, science doesn't really provide guidance. And here, skepticism, I think, is so ancient skepticism, as I described it, is a fantastic approach because it says, well, that is completely the wrong response. The response is, well, those are difficult questions. We all need to work on them. It is excellent that researchers work on them. That is super important. And the only rational thing we can do is, on the one hand, be guided by the best evidence that we currently have, and on the other hand, continue to inquire. So do not present what we currently have as if it was full knowledge, but also do not present it as if it was merely ignorance. It is, you could say it is to the best of our knowledge. This is how things look to us. And that can be a lot.
Now, time is running out quickly, unfortunately. But maybe as a final question, because I think this is a very interesting point that you gave now, this last sentence, it's that we can use skepticism to guide our questions and to maybe keep us curious and not frustrated with all these changes that are happening. As you said, we could become quite upset that science seems to tell us something different every couple of minutes. But maybe if we look at it from the stance that, oh yeah, it's good that we keep on learning, because if you would just stick to what we knew yesterday, but today we know something else, that would also be stupid. So maybe flexibility seems to be calming after all. So what I wanted to ask actually is, what would you recommend for our listeners to read as a starting point? Because you said it's a bit more difficult with the skeptics to find a good big text to jump into, but maybe is there some text that you could nonetheless recommend?
Yes. So one can, of course, read the beginning of Sextus Empiricus's Outlines of Pyrrhonism. And that is a fantastic text. And many of the questions that came up in our conversation are treated there. How do skeptics investigate? How do they talk? How do they live? How can they perform actions and all of that? Nevertheless, I would actually say go and read Plato's Apology. That is, all of these philosophers identify as Socratics. They think that Plato became too dogmatic and they are the true, they really capture the spirit of that they ascribe to Socrates. Now, what comes up in the Apology and what relates to our discussion a moment ago about big questions is that conviction that Socrates has, that on the one hand, the questions that we have to deal with are extremely important for how we live. So there's nothing more urgent for us to do than to think about, for example, what is the universe, or what is the soul, or what is good and bad. That is what we need to devote our lives to, because it is so important, because that is going to orient how we act. At the same time, these questions should be recognized as really large scale and big. It is unrealistic for anyone to assume that they have the answer. So if you put these two premises together, the questions are really big, but they totally deserve our attention. What you get is an ongoing commitment to inquiry, which is not a frustrating thing, but which is simply a rational response to the importance and the bigness of these questions.
An ongoing commitment to inquiry. I like this sentence, and I think I will use that as the ending words for this podcast. Katja Vogt, thank you so much for being here today and explaining all this to us.
Thank you for having me.
At this point, I would also like to invite our listeners to follow further wisdom talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. If you would like to share your own wisdom thoughts on the Metis portal, we encourage you to do so. We have an open call for contributions and welcome your texts or creative contributions on any topic connected to wisdom that you would like to share with the Metis community. You can find more information about this and about today's podcast in the show notes below. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.